interestingly, it's another impossible German project, which will come to grief. It used to be Germany there used to be intellectual projects initially. They were at their most successful then. I mean, all the great German thinkers were great, or very many of them were very great system builders. But these were castles in the air, impressive intellectually, of no great harm, at least immediately, and they were very, very impressive intellectual endeavors, which established Germany's cultural preeminence in the 19th century. As the country developed, it developed greater economic and also military ambitions, which led to the disaster twice, largely because the objectives were unrealistic. If one looks at it from a kind of realistic point of view, the problem was always that the objects seemed too ambitious or unlimited. These were endeavors without measure. And if you look at German foreign policy, climate policy, migration policy now, these are, again, projects without measure, unlimited in their ambitions to rescue the climate, when Germany accounts for something like 2% of the world's CO2 emissions. Even if Germany is more or less imposing her will on the European Union as a whole, it's still only about 8% of the world's total, tendency declining. Migration. In Africa, about 800,000 children are born every year. Most of these, if they are given the opportunity, would at some stage like to come to Europe. Even if you assume that only half of them want to, or only a quarter, it's impossible for Europe to absorb these numbers. It's, again, a totally unrealistic objective. The only realistic objective would be to try to foster development in these countries and encourage people to have fewer children. But development, above all, it cannot be the solution to bring these people all to Europe. All it would mean is that our standard of living will very soon approach theirs. So climate change, migration, it may well be that the German longing for European integration will be just as disastrous in its propositions. So I'm afraid we are now witnessing a kind of process in Europe, largely, I'm very sorry to say, directed, I think, by Germany, because Germany is buying, the German government is in a sense trying to buy followers for its course by spending German money, a great deal of money. We are seeing, I think, a German-inspired, German-directed project that will come to grief. It cannot succeed because it is literally, it seeks the impossible.
I'm very, I have come to the same conclusion about German thought. It's brilliant and grandiose, I guess we'll put it. I've long thought the same thing. And I've actually I've been thinking for a long time about the comparison between German and English thought, whereas English thought is, I think, from the continental perspective, often seen as very muddled and not systemic, but tends to be, I guess we'd call, closer to the ground and seems to have fewer catastrophic failures because of it, and less grandiose is, I think, the best way I can put it. And that's not necessarily to our credit either. It's just something I'd noticed, and it's quite nice that you've noticed maybe something similar. But the way that I can't help but conceive of this, it's got distinctly imperial vibes to it. It feels like this is a project where the structures of governance over Germany and over Europe have essentially taken it upon themselves to say, well, we are actually the masters of the world. And so, well, there are people over there that need our money, and so we will tempt them over here with our money. And I can't help but notice that seems to be a sort of form of neo-colonialism, because I can't help but think that if we were living in a situation where we respected the autonomy and sovereignty of other nations, we wouldn't try to drain them of human capital by recruiting their young men, the productive, hard-working segments of their population, to the tune of millions of them now. That seems to be a net drain for those countries. And eventually, I imagine, an economic benefit, even if it's just manual labourers doing manual labour for us in Europe. It feels colonial to me. It feels predatory. It feels almost vampiric. And it feels like we're beginning from the attitude as, well, it's still ours.
Well, I think there's several elements you've mentioned here, and I think there's a great deal of truth in what you've said. First of all, I think you said there's a kind of tendency that Germans know better. And
there's definitely that. I didn't.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think that's right. That somehow,
but I didn't mean specifically Germans. I meant in the West. I didn't mean specifically Germans. But
I think like you said that. However,
I didn't. But
right.
I did live in Germany for 8 years, and I will say that there is definitely a hint of that in Germans.
Yeah, I'm not denying it. By the way,
and I'm not casting aspersions either. I kind of enjoy it because I like a challenge. But there is definitely a hint of that.
Yes, I think in a very curious way, even 80 years after the war, the German government still thinks it knows best. It's teaching others. And the truth is, and that I observe in Europe too, especially as Germany is, say, telling the Poles or the Hungarians, who in a sense had a very rough time after the war, like the East Germans did, by the way, and who, in a sense, did a bit more for their freedom than the Germans who'd enjoyed it for 40 years in 1990. Nowadays there's a very regrettable tendency on the part of the German government, of practically all the leading parties in Germany, except my own party, to lecture others, tell them what you have there is not the rule of law. We alone have it. You've got to follow our approach and our standards. You've got to respect what we regard as human rights. We are always right, and I can assure you, I think the Polish government, the Polish people, the Hungarians, they do not like what they hear from the Germans. And I have to say, I don't like that attitude either. It's doing a great deal of harm, and it will over time create resentment again. At the same time, I should say that, of course, and you've admitted this, imperialism is, of course, not a purely German phenomenon.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
I think the difference, a very provisional answer.
Well, this is why I didn't want to just make it a German pathology, because I think that our government is just as guilty when it comes to immigration and the migrant. And we get a lot of immigration from the previous provinces of the British Empire. And I think it comes from London still essentially maintaining an imperial mindset. And so I wasn't trying to just say, it's the Germans saying this, or, and it's not just the Germans or the French or anyone. I think it's a Western problem, is that we had, 300 years of being the masters of the world. And so I suppose that's kind of a difficult drug to stop taking.
Yes, I think there is that element. It's there's also imperialism, straightforward and simple, often for economic reasons, often very short-term economic reasons, economic gain. And that's assuming a different form now, you could say. It used to consist in going abroad and ruling abroad. Nowadays, one is importing, shall we say, cheap labor, a cheap labor force, and that creates a kind of lowly paid class here. It creates wage competition at the bottom of the indigenous society. So again, there are economic factors. I agree with that. What I think is true, and there's that element in Germany too, I have no doubt. Nonetheless, I think there was a specific, I think the moralizing or moralistic element, dimension to that policy is more vocal in Germany. I think that is an important difference in my view. So yes, it's a universal phenomenon, but as so often, the Germans
Take it too
are
far?
well, exactly. They take it to extremes, and they always need to see some higher significance and deeper meaning in what they are doing, no matter how misconceived these may be. So that takes us.
I completely, I this is exactly the experience I had. And like I said, I always feel like I go too hard on Germans because they're always such lovely people. But as an Englishman, I always think, God, just tone it down. You've gone too far, you know.
It may be. I mean, I agree. In the sphere of the intellect, these are by and large laudable qualities. That's
Absolutely.
why we've got so many first-rate German philosophers. It may be logical, it may be inspiring, but it may not be either true or helpful if it's translated into the sphere of practical politics. I think what one could perhaps say that the German mindset is perhaps not as practical and as pragmatic as that of the Englishman. I suspect very few people would disagree with that statement.
I think so too. And it seems to be a drive for certainty, to have certainty, logical certainty, so you can predict through necessity of what will happen next. And of course, life is just simply too complex for such things.
True. I think it is exactly an overall system that it will take a very long time to establish. But once it's there, it be the key to all mythologies and problems. And I'm afraid no one's yet discovered that. But there is that German longing. It requires greater. It requires final answers. Metaphysical certainty, whereas the English, as we all know, are more likely to muddle through. They can live quite comfortable with uncertainty, and perhaps one could say are more inclined to display a degree of mental idleness.
We are stupid, yes.
And I didn't say that.
I will say it.
Even if that were, certain inherently good things may have bad consequences.
Yes.
So while some of the German achievements are very, very impressive, there's sadly, in the structural world of the world, nothing that will guarantee that great ideas inevitably have great consequences. Unfortunately, the whole thing is a lot more complicated and really quite tragic.
I always wonder how much geography has to play on this this tendency. Because I think it was Nietzsche who said that the goal of mankind is not happiness. That's what the English are looking for.
Yes, he does. He did say that.
And I found that profound because, like, well, why are we looking for that? It's, well, we live on a nice island and we don't really have. It's difficult for a threat to arrive that we can't be prepared for. Whereas I always look at the geographic position of Germany and the historic invasions of Germany from various other places and think, there but for the grace of God. You know, would I have a drive for certainty if I was worried about Viking invasions or a French king or Napoleon or the Hun coming or whatever was coming from Italy, the new Roman Empire, whatever it was? Would I have the same confident attitude that would be able to handle tomorrow? You know, I always wonder about this.
Germany, I believe, probably has more borders. Germany is the one European country with the most borders with other countries. And yes, of course, that determines a people's mindset and sense of security and the longing for certainty or safety and security, undoubtedly, and that in turn may in fact fuel preemptive strikes and the like, because one feels one cannot leave things as they are.
Yes.
One has to change the status quo because it's too dangerous. And certainly, I think that's certainly a major factor, and German historians have in fact written a great deal about what they call the Mittellager, the central position right in the heart of Europe, they regard it as a key element in explaining German foreign policy, really, in the 19th and 20th century. In a sense, and it has it's undoubtedly convincing to a degree, just as Montesquieu was right when he said, well, a people's temperament, their mores, will reflect the climate, inevitably. A people's temperament reflects the geography.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you are right to characterize the English as intellectually lazy as well, because often we are. But I always wonder, is it just that we have the opportunity to be intellectually lazy?
You could say it's a luxury.
I think it is.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think it was the Marquis of Bath who once said that aristocrats don't require intellectual stimulation. Maybe that's true.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.